Iraq is in the process of disintegrating. This an absolutely terrible situation. The Kurds have taken Kirkuk. The Sunni extremists from ISIS, this kind of spin-off of al-Qaeda, too radical for al-Qaeda, have taken Mosul and Fallujah, and they are marching right now in the direction of Baghdad. Al-Maliki, the prime minister of Iraq, has declared a state of international emergency or domestic emergency. You've got fighters from all over the world coming to join ISIS, Sunni Muslim fighters. You've got the Sunni countries, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, rooting, as it were, and perhaps funding and financing and arming. I don't know. We'll ask Dahr Jamail in just a second. The Sunni insurgents, we're arming them, the Sunni insurgents in Syria, who are going against the Bashar al-Assad government. If I'm correctly remembering his name. Dahr, welcome back to the program.
Thanks, Tom.
I wanted to get you back on for a little longer conversation here because you've been in this country, you've been in the region. I have not. I have my opinions about it, but I'm not as well informed as you are, and I just didn't want to go off and miss something or get something wrong. In many ways, can't we trace the origin of this back to this idea that Maggie Thatcher started with the war in the Falklands, that one way she tripled overnight her popularity ratings. Her popularity ratings were in the tank because she had broken the coal miners' union in the first week of coming into office in '78. And so she invaded the Falklands. She had this very short war, and she became very popular. And so during the Reagan administration, the debate was, which country are we going to invade to do like Maggie Thatcher did, because they were imitating her. They decided to do it in Grenada. And so they had, Reagan had his short war in Grenada. So then it was Bush's senior's turn to become president. The Kuwaitis were doing slant drilling under Iraq and basically stealing Saddam Hussein's oil. He goes to April Gillespie, our representative in the region, and says, can I reclaim my 37th county, what is today Kuwait, used to be part of Iraq? And she said, that's not our problem. In other words, we won't stop you. So he invades Kuwait. And George Herbert Walker Bush says, an opportunity for a short war. He has a 100-hour war and he goes in and kicks them out and then begins this sanction program that was continued under the Clinton administration, where anything that could be used to make a weapon of mass destruction, including chlorine to chlorinate public water supplies, was embargoed, which led to the death of 500,000 children from diarrheal diseases during the Clinton administration. Isn't that sort of the beginning point of all of this?
It is. I mean, the sanctions really, we can't talk about what's happening in Iraq without going all the way back to the launching of that war and the false pretext that was used to do so. And then, of course, the genocidal sanctions that killed at least 500,000 Iraqi children and probably another 1 million Iraqis on top of that from starvation and disease. And then, of course, the false pretext of using 9/11 to justify an invasion of Iraq by Bush's son, George W., and then here we are. And
there was also in the middle of that, we were supporting both sides in the Iraq-Iran war, which killed 1 million people on both sides.
Oh, absolutely. And we need to also remember that the Iraq-Iran war was launched literally the day after the U.S. hostages in Iran were released. So It was a revenge for the hostage crisis as well as a way to bleed both sides, because the U.S., of course, knew that Iraq did not have a chance against Iran, much more powerful, 3 times the size of the military, and yet supported both sides and, of course, made a lot of money off supporting Iraq in the process.
Right. And the day, by the way, that the hostages were released was the day Ronald Reagan was sworn into office.
Yeah, another important point. As you and I both know as journalists, there's no coincidence in the timings of these things. But, another thing that when we talk about the current situation in Iraq, there's if people just had a short amount of time to spend on trying to understand what's going on in why ISIS has been so effective in this really flash offensive that's going across the country right now is you can find online, there's a rough cut Reuters video that shows Iraqi military and security forces basically running out of Mosul for their lives, where they were being pushed out when Mosul was being taken over. And you can find video of even small children throwing rocks at them as they left. And I think that little video clip shows so much because, what does it mean when you have a radical group like this that has so much broad support all the way down to, kids are being raised in Iraq now to support this group. And what does this say about the future? I mean, I think right now it's really hard not to see that, or not to understand that we are looking at the beginning of another iteration of Syria and Iraq. The situation is really devolving that quickly. And as you said, not even to talk yet about the Kurds now basically annexing Kirkuk. This is absolutely massive. I mean, this sets the stage for yet a whole nother layer of the conflict of literally a government against government conflict, whereas right now we're just talking about insurgent against government.
Well, and here's what Dick Cheney, if we can just play the first half of that clip, Shane, here's what Dick Cheney had to say about what invading Iraq might do. Now, this is back during the Bush 1 administration when they only did their 100-hour war and they did not go all the way to Baghdad and were being criticized by neocons for it. Here was Cheney pushing back.
Once you got to Iraq and took it over and took down Saddam Hussein's government, then what are you going to put in its place? That's a very volatile part of the world, and if you take down the central government in Iraq, you can easily end up seeing pieces of Iraq fly off. Part of it the Syrians would like to have to the west. Part of eastern Iraq the Iranians would like to claim, fought over for 8 years. In the north, you've got the Kurds, and if the Kurds spin loose and join with the Kurds in Turkey, then you threaten the territorial integrity of Turkey. It's a quagmire.
So there you go. I mean, he was prescient, as much as I hate to say it. Your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I mean, that lined it out. The only thing that he was off on was saying that Iran would take the eastern part of Iraq, where really Iran essentially controls everything south of Baghdad at this point. But yeah, that really summed it up. And he knew at that time, as well as others during the Reagan administration and, of course, Bush 1, that another reason they didn't take him out, Saddam Hussein out at that time, was because they knew well that he basically stood as a roadblock to Iranian influence spreading across the rest of the Middle East. And, of course, not only then now did Bush Jr. remove him, but then they've brought in Maliki, who lived in Tehran for 8 years. He's with the Dawa party out of Iran and couldn't possibly be any more pro-Iranian at this point. And, we talked in the previous segment about how, the disastrous effects of bringing in such a staunchly sectarian prime minister. And that's really, 8 years of that has set the stage of what we're looking at now with so much discontent. And this is another important factor because, when you have one of the big problems with the Iraqi military, I mean, there's 1 million people in the military. This is not a small security force, and yet they are not fighting. They're just running for their lives because there's no loyalty because of the sectarianism.
Well, in fact, they're having a lot of defections right now. The Sunnis among them are defecting over to the ISIS side.
They are.
And this is another thing that Saddam Hussein was successful in doing. Not only did he hold off the Shia Iranian influence, but he also held off the al-Qaeda Sunni influence, the radical Sunnis. There was not a single al-Qaeda in Iraq during that entire period. In fact, part of our rationale for going to war was that there was one al-Qaeda guy who had one meeting in Baghdad once, and it turned out that was a lie. Saddam Hussein hated them both and stopped them both. Not to lionize the guy, but hey, the life in Tehran in the 1970s and 1980s, or in Baghdad, was a hell of a lot better than it has been since we started messing in the region.
Well, that's right. I mean, that's one thing that most despots are good at is keeping their thumb.
Here's your B-roll, Jim.
Very, very, very pressed down on the security situation. I mean, and that is really the kind of the great irony, the tragic irony of the situation is there was zero terrorism in the country until the U.S. invaded. And now, look, we've got arguably now 1/3 of the geographic area of the entire country is now under the direct control of terrorists. I mean, it's definitely a worse nightmare situation.
Yeah, we're showing on the screen right now for the people watching us on television, we're showing some footage from the very early 80s of downtown Baghdad, of weddings and people walking through the streets and normal life. And women not wearing headscarves and walking to work and driving to work wearing pantsuits. I mean, it was a contemporary non-religious state, sectarian state. Yeah, now that's his sons were pretty bad guys, and he was letting them do what they wanted. But man, we screwed this thing up.
Well, there was security, and at the time, it was one of the best places in the Middle East to be for women's rights as well. Women were, of course, encouraged to be part of the government, get higher education, and be very, very present and play an extremely active role in civil society, and they did. And that's why Iraq during the 80s had one of the best education systems in the Middle East, had one of the best healthcare systems in the entire region. And all that is gone now. I mean, we can go down a almost seemingly endless list at this point of how virtually every aspect of life in Iraq has degraded dramatically since the U.S. invaded in 2003. I mean, we talked about the sanctions earlier, 1.5 million people dead, and that's looked at now in Iraq as a golden time. As people are existing on about 1,700 calories a day per person, and people are wishing it was that good again.
Yeah, it's amazing. Dahr Jamail, writer for Truthout.org, and a longtime brilliant journalist. Dahr, thank you so much for the great work you do.
Thank you, Tom.
And thanks for coming on and sharing your perspective with us. We'll be back.